A warrior of a distant world collapses from starvation on a hostile planet. But when she wakes, it isn't an enemy she finds, it's a human, holding a meal she never expected. In a galaxy full of danger, sometimes survival isn't about weapons. It's about trust, laughter, and the most unlikely friendships. The alien warrior staggered across the jagged plains of the planet, each step a battle in itself. Her long ears twitched and flicked at the slightest sound. The whine of distant machinery, the hiss of the wind sculpting the red dust into miniature dunes, the soft crunch of her own boots against the brittle, fractured ground. Hunger gnawed at her belly with the persistence of a sentient parasite. Not a simple ache, not the faint pangs that one could ignore or swat away. It was the kind of hunger that made her vision swim, her muscles ache, and her tongue dry to the point that even swallowing her own saliva felt like a challenge designed by some cosmic prankster. She muttered under her breath in her guttural language, cursing the engineers, the mission planners, and possibly the universe itself, though she knew the universe wouldn't care. Somewhere behind her, a jagged ridge cast a long shadow across the dusty terrain, and she realized she had been walking in circles for the last hour, or maybe 3. Time had begun to feel elastic, stretching and snapping back with no warning. She stumbled over a jagged rock, her boots kicking up small clouds of metallic-tinted dust. "Really?" she grumbled, almost to herself. A warrior of my renown reduced to tripping over pebbles like a child. Her ears flattened in irritation, but the dust storm that followed made her sneeze violently, sending a tiny cloud of sand into her eyes. She squinted through the grit, glaring at the barren horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a jagged formation shimmered in the half-light of the dying sun, but whether it was shelter, an ambush, or just another cruel trick of the landscape, she couldn't tell. She took another step, then another, each one more laborious than the last. Her stomach growled so loudly that she imagined a creature from the planet itself could hear it and judge her for it. "Great!" she muttered. "Even the wildlife is laughing at me." She collapsed onto her knees suddenly, then onto her side, the long ears dangling flat against her shoulders. The wind whipped at her hair, silver strands tangled and glinting in the waning sunlight. She could feel the strength draining from her muscles, the world tilting and spinning, the edges of consciousness fraying like old fabric. Somewhere far above, a small craft, or maybe a shooting star, cut across the pinkish sky, and she imagined it was laughing at her predicament. She tried to lift a hand, to curse it, to somehow make the universe pay for this humiliation, but her arms felt like lead, her fingers tingling. The last coherent thought that passed through her mind was, "This is not heroic at all asterisk," and then everything went black. When she came to, the sensation was disorienting, not the darkness she had expected, but a warm, faintly aromatic air that smelled vaguely edible. Her eyelids fluttered open, heavy as they were, and her gaze fell upon a human. Not a hostile one, not a soldier, not even a galactic bounty hunter. Just a human man, standing with a tray in his hands, looking like he had no idea how to hold it properly without dropping everything. The tray bore steaming food, something she couldn't immediately identify, though the smell alone was enough to make her stomach protest with a violent, almost musical growl. Her ears twitched in suspicion, then wariness, and finally something closer to disbelief. She had spent lifetimes on the battlefield, encountering enemies with elaborate disguises and lethal intentions, yet here was a human holding a tray, smiling nervously, and offering her food. The human shifted from foot to foot, as if trying to figure out the correct balance between friendly and don't make her mad, which was a precarious position indeed. Hello," he said. I thought you might, want something to eat? I mean, you look like you could use it." His voice wavered, a mixture of hope, anxiety, and the kind of earnestness that made him simultaneously endearing and slightly comical. The alien warrior's eyes narrowed, and she tilted her head, studying him. He looked harmless, which made her instinctive caution twitch like an old reflex muscle. Yet the warmth of the scent, the soft clatter of utensils on the tray, even the faint hiss of the little robot hovering beside him attempting to offer a napkin, chipped away at her suspicion. She could practically hear her pride grumbling. "A warrior of your caliber, reduced to accepting a meal from a human asterisk. Still, she allowed herself to sit up, slowly, cautiously, and extended a hand toward the tray. The human flinched slightly at the movement, almost dropping it, then recovered with a clumsy bow. She lifted a piece of whatever the food was, a slab of meat-like material, surprisingly tender, with a side of vegetable-like orbs that smelled vaguely sweet. She brought it to her mouth, chewing slowly, tasting the flavors that her body had been screaming for hours to experience. The human watched, utterly fascinated, occasionally glancing at her long ears, and then down at the tray, as if expecting some cosmic explosion at any moment. When she swallowed, she let out a soft, almost reluctant noise that sounded like approval, or at least the nearest approximation her species had. The human exhaled, relief flooding his features, and muttered, "Okay, good. You like it. That's great." As they sat there, she couldn't help but notice the human's awkward habits. The way he fumbled with utensils, the robot hovering like a slightly overeager butler, the strange half-smile that appeared whenever he thought she might be looking at him. There was a ridiculousness to it, a levity in the midst of what should have been a dire moment. Her ears twitched, then quivered slightly, and she snorted, a sound that startled the human, who took a step back as if she had just summoned some ancient predator. "Relax," she said, her voice low and amused. "I haven't eaten you yet." He laughed nervously, and then, seeing her eyes narrow with just a hint of mischief, he added, "I mean, unless you want to, not that never mind." She shook her head, and the faintest hint of a smile tugged at her lips. Humor, she realized, could be as disarming as any weapon, and here it was, offered freely by a species she had been trained to distrust. Minutes stretched into an hour as they shared the awkward, tentative conversation of beings who were simultaneously curious and cautious about each other. She recounted tales of her campaigns, embellishing some and omitting others. The time she had accidentally slipped into a quagmire of biolava. For instance, she narrated with enough melodrama to make even herself wince at her own exaggeration. The human responded with stories of Earth, of gravity-free yoga mishaps, and the peculiar human fondness for combining unlikely foods. Laughter broke out occasionally, tentative at first, then more genuine, as though the universe itself had pressed pause to enjoy the absurdity of it all. Through it all, the alien warrior felt something unexpected, the tight coil of suspicion and exhaustion loosening. Trust was fragile, yes, but it could also be nurtured in moments like these. Over a shared meal, a clumsy joke, a fleeting glance at a long-eared face that was not so different from her own after all. She realized that perhaps survival did not always demand combat or cunning, but sometimes just the willingness to accept the improbable generosity of someone entirely alien. The sky above deepened to a violet hue, streaked with bands of clouds that reflected the dying sun like molten metal. Somewhere in the distance, a dust devil spun lazily, indifferent to the scene unfolding beneath it. She leaned back on her arms, her ears twitching, and glanced at the human who still fumbled nervously with a pot he had brought for tea. He looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, the warrior felt something like hope, not the grandiose hope of victory in battle, but the quieter, steadier hope of finding unexpected allies in the vast, indifferent galaxy. She allowed herself another bite, then a small, amused snort, and muttered, "I suppose I can survive a little longer if humans are always this unpredictable." The human grinned, slightly unsure whether she meant it as compliment or insult, but too relieved to care. And as they sat together, under the alien sky, with the robot occasionally offering commentary on the merits of table manners, the warrior thought, with no small measure of amusement, that perhaps the universe was not entirely cruel. It could be funny, awkward, and surprisingly kind, and she might just survive this hunger after all. The alien warrior's ears twitched as she stood from her makeshift resting place, brushing dust from her silver hair with one long-fingered hand, while the human fumbled in the corner of the room, clearly overestimating the strength required to carry a pot of tea. The room itself was a curious anomaly. Part shelter, part laboratory, part chaotic assemblage of things that probably shouldn't have been in the same room without sparking some minor explosion. Holographic panels flickered intermittently, displaying incomprehensible star maps and maintenance logs for systems she didn't recognize. A half-dismantled hover drone attempted to balance on one leg in the corner, as though it, too, were unsure whether it belonged to her savior or the universe itself. She arched an eyebrow at it, her long ears flattening briefly, a reflexive gesture that might have conveyed her judgment had the human noticed. The human cleared his throat, attempting to look confident despite his trembling hands. "So, breakfast?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward a tray he had balanced precariously on the edge of a counter. The alien warrior's stomach grumbled audibly, eliciting a startled glance from him. "Right," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Maybe I should sit down while you eat. Safety first." He sat, knees knocking together slightly, and she allowed herself a small, amused snort. Safety first, she mused, long ears twitching with the faintest hint of sarcasm from food. Really human. She reached for a piece of the steaming food. A cube of protein she guessed had been synthesized, though it tasted far too good to be synthetic, and chewed slowly, savoring the flavors while she observed him. He was awkward in a way that was strangely endearing, glancing at her, then at the tray, then at a small, hovering assistant that occasionally beeped as if to remind him of his inadequacies. She tilted her head, ears flicking with curiosity. "What planet did you say this was again?" she asked, the words low, amused, almost teasing. "Earth," he said, puffing out his chest, though it did little to hide the fact that his knees were still knocking. "Well, Earth, sort of. I mean, it's a colony outpost on Proxima Centauri Beta, but, Earth-derived. Totally safe, unless your definition of safe involves walking into random alien creatures collapsing from hunger." He smiled awkwardly, and she snorted, nearly spilling a portion of the protein cube she had just popped into her mouth. "Interesting definition of safety," she said, her voice dripping with amusement, long ears twitching in rhythm with her words. She gestured vaguely with one hand at the floating holographic panels, the half-assembled gadgets, and the precarious stacks of alien artifacts that leaned against the wall as if gravity had decided to take a day off. "You humans really know how to organize chaos." He waved a hand, sheepish. "We try, mostly. The dust storms here don't make it easy, you know." He paused, leaning forward slightly, as though preparing for a confession. "And the gravity flux. That thing is a nightmare. I swear my tea has plotted mutiny 3 times this morning alone." The warrior blinked, then let out a low, throaty laugh, a sound that echoed slightly off the metal walls. She hadn't realized she could laugh like that at a human's foolishness, but somehow, in this bizarre, dusty room under an alien sky, it felt appropriate. Her long ears flicked toward him, as though nudging her own amusement forward. "Mutiny, you say, the tea," she teased. "Perhaps you should prepare your defenses. It might strike back when you least expect it." The human chuckled nervously, then carefully lifted the teapot, giving it a cautious pour into 2 cups. I'll keep that in mind," he said. "Though I think if it ever rises against me, it'll have to deal with you first. Giant alien warrior versus sentient tea. Fairly even fight, I'd say." She arched a brow at him, and his words elicited another snort, a short, amused burst of sound that made the hover drone beep in alarm. "I fight actual warlords," she said, voice low, mock serious. "Sentient beverages are trivial." Her tone softened slightly, though, as she regarded him with a faint curiosity. "Yet somehow you fed me and kept me alive. That is no trivial thing, human." He shrugged, offering a sheepish smile. "Hey, we all have our talents," he said. "Some of us can pilot ships through plasma storms, some can assemble hover drones without blowing up the lab, and some can make food that doesn't immediately kill a starving alien warrior." He chuckled, and she allowed herself the smallest, almost imperceptible smile. Minutes stretched lazily, punctuated by the occasional clumsy gesture or accidental bump of the floating robot against a console. Conversation flowed slowly, often circling back on itself, sometimes descending into absurd tangents. The human tried to explain Earth's concept of taxes, which she found utterly baffling, while she regaled him with tales of her campaigns, exaggerating the more embarrassing defeats with dramatic flair. At one point, she described a skirmish with a sentient drone swarm. only to admit halfway through that she had tripped over her own foot and fallen into a shallow crater. The human laughed so hard he nearly dropped his cup of tea, and she couldn't help but let out a low, amused growl, her long ears twitching in delight. As the laughter died down, she noticed something she hadn't expected. A sense of comfort, a rare and almost alien sensation in itself. Not the security of a fortified base or the advantage of a well-planned ambush, but the kind of warmth that came from shared laughter, mutual respect, and small, unspoken acts of kindness. She studied the human as he fumbled again with a tray, this time offering her a slice of synthetic fruit. "Here," he said, careful to keep his tone casual, "for dessert. You deserve it after all that falling." She accepted it, biting into the surprisingly juicy cube. "Dessert after defeat," she muttered, long ears twitching with amusement, "is almost poetic." She glanced at him, noting the mixture of pride and nervousness in his expression, and found herself thinking that perhaps, even in the vast, unpredictable galaxy, humor and kindness could be as effective as a plasma rifle. The hours passed lazily, punctuated by clumsy attempts at cleaning up the room and sporadic, teasing jabs at each other's behavior. She learned his name, Michael, though he insisted on Mike for brevity, and he learned hers, though he mangled the pronunciation repeatedly, each attempt drawing a small, amused snort or a roll of her long ears. They shared stories, jokes, and moments of quiet observation. The way the twin suns set behind jagged mountains, casting elongated shadows across the dust-strewn floor, the faint hum of the ship's engines somewhere overhead, the soft flicker of holographic panels as they displayed irrelevant but mesmerizing star charts. At one point, the alien warrior caught herself laughing at a particularly ridiculous human anecdote about zero-gravity pancakes. She almost choked on her synthetic fruit cube, ears flattening in sudden surprise, and he leapt forward, nearly colliding with the hover drone in an attempt to help her. She waved him off, chuckling despite herself, realizing that this fragile creature, this human, had already begun to carve a small space in her heart for trust. Not the grand trust of alliances forged on battlefields, but the quieter, subtler trust of those who had seen you at your weakest and still offered something without expectation of return. By the time the twin moons of Proxima Centauri Beta rose high in the sky, casting silver and violet light through the room's dusty windows, the alien warrior leaned back against the counter, ears flicking lazily, hair catching the dim light in strands of silver. She watched Mike as he fussed over cleaning the teapot, the hovering robot occasionally reminding him to wipe the counter, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long while. A sense of ease, of humor, of warmth. She even allowed herself another slice of synthetic fruit, savoring the absurdity of the situation. "This," she said finally, voice low but amused, "is not the worst day I've ever had." Mike looked up, eyes wide, unsure whether this was a compliment or faint sarcasm. "Not the worst day," he repeated. "No," she said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips, ears twitching. "I suppose it's tolerable, even enjoyable, in a very limited sense of the word." He grinned, and the hover drone beeped enthusiastically, perhaps in agreement, perhaps in confusion. They shared a quiet moment, a pause in which the galaxy outside could rage, storms could tear across planets, but inside this small, chaotic room, laughter, warmth, and an unlikely friendship were quietly taking root. And as the alien warrior considered the absurdity of laughing over a cup of tea with a human who could barely balance a tray, she realized something. Maybe, just maybe, survival in this galaxy didn't require constant vigilance and endless suspicion. Sometimes it required letting go, even if just a little, and finding humor, and perhaps even trust, in the unlikeliest of companions. The alien warrior stretched, her long ears flicking lazily as she surveyed the small, chaotic room that had, over the past few days, transformed from a strange human hideout into something that felt almost like a base of operations, though one entirely improvised. The floating robot hovered near the ceiling, performing its usual erratic patrols, and the human, Michael, or Mike, as he insisted she call him, was busy fussing over a console, adjusting settings on a small, whirring device that seemed to measure something she didn't care to understand. What mattered was that for the first time in a long while, she felt grounded. Not in the physical sense. Gravity still worked against her in stubborn, uneven ways, but in a way that made the endless stretches of space and perilous skirmishes feel distant, almost trivial. "Hey," she said, her voice low but amused. "Why does your little machine keep beeping every time I move?" Her ears twitched, one arching sharply as she tilted her head. Mike jumped, nearly spilling the tray of freshly synthesized snacks he had prepared as an afternoon diversion. "Ah, that's just a proximity alert. It's mostly to keep track of things. Important things." His words trailed off as he realized they sounded entirely meaningless, and he gave her a sheepish grin. She snorted, the sound low and throaty, like the echo of distant thunder across the jagged plains outside. "Important things," she repeated, "like keeping an eye on a starving warrior who could probably crush you with one hand." He laughed nervously. "Exactly, totally essential safety precaution," he said, waving a hand dismissively, though his fingers fumbled as usual. She shook her head, amused, and reached for one of the snacks. The little cubes of protein were still warm, their aroma strangely comforting in a room full of blinking panels and half-assembled devices. "You humans," she muttered, chewing slowly, "have an interesting way of taking care of things, very indirect. And you aliens have a very interesting way of making every day an adventure," he countered, finally daring to meet her gaze. "Honestly, I don't know if I should thank you for showing up or curse the universe for making me responsible for feeding you." She tilted her head, considering this, and let out a soft, amused laugh. Her long ears flicked forward and back in a rhythm that seemed to punctuate her amusement. "Both, perhaps," she said. "The universe has a sense of humor, and clearly it enjoys watching warriors collapse from hunger while humans scramble to save them." She paused, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Though I must admit it was not unpleasant, this unexpected alliance." Mike blinked. "Alliance? That sounds official. I was just trying to survive without breaking your ribs or getting zapped by your instincts." He chuckled, but she caught the humor in his tone and allowed herself another amused snort. The corners of her mouth quirked upward in a way that would have been subtle on most humans, but on her long, elegant face, it carried an air of genuine warmth. Outside, the twin moons of Proxima Centauri Beta began their ascent, bathing the room in silvery light. Shadows danced across the metallic surfaces, painting the space with patterns that shifted with the flicker of holographic panels. Somewhere in the distance, the planet's twin suns had left trails of molten pink and orange behind the jagged horizon. It was a quiet moment, the kind of silence that begged reflection rather than alarm, and the alien warrior realized how much she had changed in the span of days. Hunger had been her undoing, exhaustion had brought her low, and yet here she was, alive, laughing, and, most unexpectedly, caring for a human who had proven himself more resourceful, kind, and humorous than any of her previous allies. "I never thought I'd say this," she said finally, her voice softening, "but your persistence is admirable, even if you do spill everything you touch." She flicked a small speck of dust off the hover drone with a delicate hand, watching it wobble slightly in the low gravity. Mike laughed, scratching the back of his neck, a gesture that had become almost habitual. "Thanks, I think. I've had a lot of practice surviving, mostly without alien warriors fainting around me." He gestured vaguely at her, and she shook her head, ears twitching in amusement. They spent the next hour in what had become a comfortable routine. Mike tinkering with machinery, the warrior sampling various snacks and occasionally offering sarcastic commentary, and the robot providing unnecessary commentary that neither of them paid much attention to. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern that made the chaotic room feel like something approaching home. Eventually, the conversation turned to future plans. She spoke cautiously, mindful of her pride, but the human's earnestness and humor had begun to chip away at the armor she had carried for years. "I will need to continue my mission," she admitted, long ears twitching as she considered the implications. "But I would be foolish to ignore the companionship that has been offered here." Mike tilted his head, suspicious of her unusually diplomatic phrasing. "Companionship, huh? That sounds serious, dangerous even. You know, bonding with humans can be complicated." Emotional entanglements, sarcastic humor, spontaneous tea parties. He gestured vaguely, waving his hands as though summing up the galaxy's entire collection of absurd risks. She snorted, soft and low. You humans have an interesting way of summing things up. I suppose I am willing to take the risk. Her gaze flicked toward the window, toward the red plains stretching beyond the shelter. Perhaps it is time to explore trust in forms I had never imagined. Small, unassuming forms, like a meal prepared for a weary warrior or a clumsy human who persists in trying to care. Mike grinned, relieved, though slightly puzzled. You know, I think this might be the start of something remarkable, possibly dangerous, definitely absurd, but I like it. Outside, the planet seemed to hum softly, a deep vibration in the rocks beneath their feet. Somewhere above, the stars shifted imperceptibly, distant systems twinkling as if acknowledging the fragile alliance forming in the shelter below. The alien warrior realized, with an odd mixture of amusement and humility, that life could be unpredictable, and yet sometimes surprisingly kind. The following day, they ventured beyond the shelter together, testing low-gravity terrain and occasionally tripping over each other, their laughter echoing across the barren landscape. The alien warrior found herself sharing small details of her culture, her campaigns, her humor, things she had never imagined offering to another being outside of her species. The human, in turn, shared Earth's peculiar inventions, failed experiments, and odd culinary habits, which she found endlessly entertaining. Each moment, each shared joke, and every accidental stumble solidified the trust that had begun with something as simple as a meal. A small skirmish with a territorial sand creature provided another unexpected lesson in teamwork. She had initially planned to dispatch it with ease, but the human's clever improvisation, a device that emitted an oddly irritating ultrasonic tone, disoriented the creature long enough for them to escape without injury. She laughed afterward, her ears flicking with genuine amusement. You humans, you invent the strangest weapons, she said, and somehow they work. He shrugged, grinning. That's our secret: chaos, confusion, and occasionally edible snacks. By the time they returned to the shelter, the warrior's perspective had shifted subtly but profoundly. She realized that heroism and strength were not only measured in victories and conquests, but in the willingness to trust, to share, and to embrace the unexpected humor of life. The human had not only saved her body, but had nurtured a part of her spirit she had long thought dormant. Her pride remained intact, but it was tempered now by a warmth she hadn't known she could feel for another being outside her species. As night fell, the twin moons casting their silver light over the jagged plains, they sat side by side, the robot hovering lazily nearby, and the alien warrior allowed herself to feel content. She was no longer the solitary figure driven solely by hunger and survival. She had discovered laughter, companionship, and in the quiet aftermath of their adventures, under alien moons and the silent stars, the alien warrior realized that she had changed. Her strength was no longer measured only by combat prowess, but by her capacity to trust, to laugh, and to embrace the improbable kindness of a human companion who had, in his own awkward, endearing way, shown her that even in the harshest reaches of space, warmth could be found in the most unexpected of places. The stars above twinkled like distant promises.